Well, again, a welcome, and a special welcome to the watchers of Portal 24 who are with us this morning. I'm not, as it may seem, Martin Butorer, who was to chair this panel. Martin Butorer was promoted to Discussant, so I am not Lipinski. Yes. So he is not Lipinski, and I substitute him as moderator of this panel. My name is Herterich, and it's always a strange situation if the most unknown on the panel is introducing the very much known to the audience, but as it is common, I will do. Martin Butorer, I already mentioned him, from Bratislava. He's honorary president of the Institute for Public Affairs. He has done work in academia. He was a diplomat. Among others, he was the Slovak ambassador to the United States. And last not least, one of the most important assignments, I guess, he was human rights advisor to Václav Havel. Our first speaker will be Jiří Přibáň, professor from Cardiff University, dealing with sociology, law, and philosophy. I will not go into his academic appointments, but we would consume most of the time of the panel if I did that. I just sum them up. I had never the privilege to sit next to such a global professor as Jiří Přibáň is. And also, what I want to underline is with this broad experience worldwide, he's best equipped, but he does regular commentaries on BBC World Service. I do mention that because for a German as myself, in Germany it's very often still seen as an academic achievement if you don't appear in public television. So I'm happy that you are on top of the Anglo-Saxon tradition in that respect. I already said Martin Butorer was jumping in as discussant, and I was jumping in as moderator. To make it complete, Jiří Přibáň just told me that he forgot his papers and his notes, so you will have the benefit of a totally improvised panel here. Let me start with, I think it was Jean-Claude Juncker who was cited with the word that, in reference to the European Council, he said, actually we all know more or less exactly what to do or what we should do to cope with the crisis of the euro. Well, the reason that we don't do it is that we all are afraid of not being re-elected again. And this may be the beginning of a spiral, a negative spiral of depoliticizing the whole policies of the European Union. Because of this reason, for example, Angela Merkel postponed the first umbrella for 2 months, I think, because she was waiting for regional elections in North Rhine-Westphalia in Germany. She lost these elections anyhow. She ruled out because of this Eurobonds and so on. and everything is tied to domestic politics, the next elections. And in Brussels, we have excellent civil servants. Their most excellency is to turn political questions into technical questions. And then the politicians, at least in Germany, say our policy is without alternative. And who is benefiting from this playing down of modification and so on are actually the populists from the right and from the left. In Germany, they called their new party Alternative to Germany, and they put the finger on a point. My basic question is that is it this kind of depolitization which opens the space not only for populists who address the European questions in a controversial way, but should open it also for civil society and its advances in the European Union. And so I give the word to Jiří.
Okay, thank you very much. I still hope that I am Jiří Přibáň, sitting here after your introduction, because everyone else has been promoted to different positions and different people, but I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I feel very, very privileged to have this opportunity and address this audience, which also is quite unique, and it's not just academics, it's not just politicians, it's the public, and especially it's younger generation, it's the next generation who we need to reload and transform our solidarity pact with, the generation solidarity pact. But before I start, yes, you put it in the public domain that this computer thing isn't just showing off that I recently acquired an Apple, but that is the consequence of my mistakes and forgetfulness, that I left my papers at home. But before we start, let me briefly comment on what we heard yesterday and what was summarized here by many different people, like Europe as a project of values. And I know that in this particular setting, with this institutional framework, values are considered something automatic, taken for granted, something nice, good, that we all want to share, promote, and build our society on. And let me be a bit heretical, because values can be equally divisive, and politics of values can be very harmful, and we know that we don't share, we have clash of values, and I want to use one particular image from a famous Czech, probably the most important Czech novelist, Karel Čapek. We all are familiar with the novel The Absolute at Large, Továrna na absolutno, in which people became so ethical and so keen on promoting and making good that it all ended up in disaster and divisions. And this difference, of course, it reflects on what Max Weber called new polytheism, or the war of the gods, that behind the instrumental rationality and technique, there is this deep, divisive, value-oriented world in which we all are going to clash and have new and nasty violent conflicts. One example, so this is the difference between politics of interest, politics of values. However, and from this perspective, this historical perspective, the European Union actually started as a technical project, and I believe that Jean Monnet was just playing with words, was just being a bit narcissistic when he said we should have started with culture. No, it was impossible. There were so many cultural divisions that you had to start with the European project. You knew what you wanted to escape from the deep civilizational confrontation and almost annihilation of Europe as we knew it. So the post-war project was absolutely right to start from one technicality. Limit the production and regulate the production of steel and coal, because with this regulation you avoid the next war, rearmament of Europe in nation states. Second, if you want to have the common market, and market is a technical thing which can work towards, which can gloss over value divisions. It doesn't matter whether you are French, German, or Belgian, because we have these techniques of unification. Sometimes people, and we know that the European anthem, that there is a little symbol, people say there is little symbolism, not enough symbolism, not enough shared values in Europe. The anthem, the European anthem, is Ode to Joy. We know it. Ode to Joy is a jolly, nice piece of music. It's been turned into pop, but I always have one particular image of this, which is from Tengiz Abuladze's film Repentance, in which you have the music of the Ode to Joy, humankind moving, marching towards liberty and humanity, and on the picture, on the screen, you have people suffering in the name of these values of humanity, suffering the worst torture in the hands of the worst tyrants. Is there any alternative? I always say we can choose between great values of Ode to Joy and something which is less ambitious, which is the music by Kraftwerk, which is a German techno music, famous, iconic band, nevertheless, and which is completely dehumanized. It's a post-humanist music, it's a post-humanist culture. However, Kraftwerk made a great album in the 70s, which tells you how old I am, but I wasn't even a teenager then, but when I first listened to the album called Trans-Europa Express. What is Europe today? What is great element of European integration? Is it politics of depoliticization in Brussels? And I'm afraid I didn't share optimism of some commentators on Milena Vicenova's talk yesterday. Frankly, I found it quite chilling and almost, I don't know whether she's here because I would like to have a conversation. Her talk reminded me almost like the marriage in crisis, when after you have the storm is gathering, yet partners tell each other, like she's saying, Europe is beautiful, like our relationship is nice, isn't it? Let's keep it, let's preserve it. We are good, we are on the side of the good. You don't understand, the electorate doesn't understand how much we're doing for you. No, we don't understand. Because today, this politics of depoliticization is divisive. As we heard yesterday from Klaus Offe, the euro, this technical instrument, probably the most sophisticated instrument of supranational governance, is not uniting Europeans, it's dividing them, and what is even worse, it's dividing them against the old phantoms that we thought would be long dead and buried in the European ground. ethno-nationalism, so that today we know again that Germans are basically Nazis and Greeks are lazy who cannot run their state. Shocking, worst stereotypical ethnic prejudices are re-emerging and gathering force even in countries which are beyond Eurozone, such as Britain. So, Kraftwerk delivers on technology, but cannot deliver on politics. However, Kraftwerk and Trans-Europa Express today, if you look at young generation, it's, I'm so envious of the young generation which simply jumps on EasyJet or even that dreadful Trabant like Ryanair, and that treats you like, yeah, you feel like in Belarus when you're on Ryanair, but still it takes you there to your destination, and simply Europe is a common space. Europe is part of everyday experience, only we don't think about it as something precious, we take it for granted. Things that used to be taken for granted are not to be granted anymore. So, going back to the European Union, and my thesis will be, yes, politicization is already taking place, and I will go through some steps in the politicization of the European Union. But politicization is going to take place whether bureaucrats like it or not. We should criticize this simplification of the problems of Europe, that those who are against Europe are almost automatically populist, authoritarian and nationalist, and therefore enemies of Europe. We have to confront these populisms and ethno-nationalism on political ground. And that's why I found one of the most important things said yesterday. I found Kateřina Šafaříkova's comment on that Europe shies away from conflict. We have to build a much more conflict-driven polity than we are ready to admit. Because today, populism and whether extreme or right or extreme left, they are taking and they are riding on the democratic legitimacy rhetoric. That they say, we are true democrats, we protect you from those who are authoritarian, anti-democratic. And if you look at the Euro crisis, frankly, if Italy doesn't have a choice but to accept appointed prime minister whose main qualification is that he used to work for the most important private financial institutions, therefore he is best qualified, we are in deep trouble. However, I don't want to sound too alarmistic or skeptical. So what is the union today? As some people present it, is the unity of conceptual contradictions. In modern democratic polity, power always circulates between the people, party politics, administration, and the public opinion, which is communicated through the mass media. That was very important that we had the media represented here yesterday. While the principle of popular sovereignty, so the sovereignty by the people, provides the system with democratic legitimacy, political parties struggle to win power by winning a majority of the votes of the people, and thus form a government administering specific policies for the people. This is almost like social theory's reformulation of that classic Gettysburg Address, government of the people, by the people, for the people. So we know that it circulates. And we know that at European level, we don't have this circulation. Nevertheless, this endlessly discussed democratic deficit is not just, you can't just say, well, because we have no European people, we have to stop with European integration, because European integration hasn't been promoted by, or hasn't been dependent on the European, the idea of the European people, the European demos. It's one of the drawbacks of the German Maastricht. I don't want to be critical of the German Constitutional Court. Nevertheless, the Maastricht Treaty, the Maastricht Treaty judgment is very, as when you want to avoid direct confrontation and criticism in English, you always say it's somewhat idiosyncratic. So it's somewhat idiosyncratic. In the absence of European democratic government, and let's not pretend that European institutions have this direct democratic realism, its legitimacy was traditionally democratically legitimized. It was governing for European governance was here for the people or for the peoples of the European Union. And please, I know I'm speaking in most beautiful country in which nevertheless senior politicians directly compare the European Union to the Soviet Union. And they don't, they really mean it. In which senior politicians simply were using a scarecrow of the Euro crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and Greece. We don't want to be next Greece. When we know that the economic crisis actually was the market crisis bailed out by the states, by the European Union, and this is going to be a very interesting case in in Luxembourg now with the preliminary question about the European Stability Pact. But we know that this crisis is much more complex than the Greek problem. This is the Irish problem, that people who lived prudently nevertheless shared their money and credit with fraudsters in the finance businesses. This is the Spanish problem, and this is the country which has otherwise the sovereign that is much healthier macroeconomic data than, for instance, the Britain, which is outside the Eurozone. So it's a much more complex problem than we have time to discuss here, because I have like 10 minutes now left. The European governance traditionally was developing, and legitimacy of the European project and European integration was administrative, economic, and juridical legal project legitimized by common benefit. Whatever the drawback and the cost of European integration may be, the benefit outweighs the cost. In this country, just look back 10 years ago, and now the country has benefited from its European. The Central Eastern Europe benefited in terms of security, the Copenhagen criteria, and I was very glad to read in the papers this morning that the European Union seriously considers stopping negotiations with Turkey because the President of Turkey just signed the new law clamping down on the media, so that the Copenhagen conditionality process significantly improved the quality of political accountability of political elites in this country and other countries. And I'm not, economic prosperity is undoubtedly another aspect of it. And yes, there are costs, but benefits always are. This legitimacy by common benefit cannot be used anymore, because now we know that the European integration reached the stage when you need further politicization. And I remember when I gave a talk many years ago at Warwick University and at their European Law Theory seminar series, and the organizer was a German professor who was he was giving me a lift to the from the station to the university, and we were chatting about it, and it was right after the constitutional referenda failure in France and the Netherlands. And he said, European Union was a nice project until, a good project and working project until politicians started meddling up with it. Basically, before politicians started talking about democratic legitimation, we had decent project legitimized by legality, administration, and common benefit of the economy. But of course, he didn't mention the fact that ever since the post-Maastricht condition, Europe needed its democratization. It needed its politicization. And it's parodied that its constitutional project was actually rejected in the referendum, the democratic instrument, direct democracy instrument. Nevertheless, you might think, let's stop talking about democratization. No, if you look at the Lisbon Treaty, drafters of the Lisbon Treaty were are very aware of this exhaustion of the neo-functionalist legitimacy by outcomes, and that we need more democracy in Europe is described in its opening paragraphs, preamble. I'm quoting, desiring to complete the process started by the Treaty of Amsterdam and by the Treaty of Nice, with a view to enhancing the efficiency and democratic legitimacy of the Union, and to improving the coherence of its action, and so on. So, efficiency, legitimacy by outcomes, is co-evil, goes hand in hand with enhancement of democratic procedures and democratization of the European Union. I don't want to go into details because I know about the reputation of lawyers as the most boring people in the room, but if you check the Lisbon Treaty, it goes it realizes the difference between European governments and national democratic governments and how to enhance democracy. In its title to the first article, it's interesting, Article 9 of the treaty opens with the first principle of Europe. And what is this principle? This is what was mentioned briefly yesterday. It's the rule of law, rights, civic rights, the rule of law, democratic accountability. The first principle of Europe is equality of all citizens before the law. This is where justice, political justice, begins. And the fact that we are discussing this political and extent of political justice and even social justice, yes, the immigration talk in European countries, especially in old Europe, is getting nastier. Nevertheless, it's a response to a particular and very strong principle and guarantee. Freedom of movement of persons means that you can be Czech, Pole, Brit, German, French, but if you start working somewhere, if you start contributing to the welfare system, you have the right of access to welfare benefits in that country. How it's managed is another issue, but it's a technical issue. The main fact is, if you contribute, you know, especially in Britain, tabloids are now very much after those Poles stealing the benefits from the Brits. And of course, it takes an economist to summarize and say, well, actually, these Poles are contributing by their taxes to the welfare system and to the budget much more than many Brits. Why should they be excluded from their child benefits, from their access to healthcare, when they are actually working harder than the population that would ethnically be described as native? Okay? I hate this play of natives against immigrants. Okay, so this is the first principle. However, it doesn't stop there. The Lisbon Treaty speaks about Article 10, and this is and of course, we have this long history of the Lex Austria and how to combat extremism at European level. Nevertheless, we have the principle. It's like the twin representation. The principle of the Union is the twin representation of citizens and states. And states must be democracies. There's no question about it. There's no question around it. And this is exactly where values and interests, processes meet. So I'm not against politics of values. I'm just warning against the propaganda of values and controversy of them. Let's not shy away from controversies. So the Union has been evolving from policy making. Isn't it awful, those bureaucrats in Brussels, always clamping down on our freedoms? Frankly, I'm much more scared of bureaucrats in Prague and even bureaucrats in London. You can't imagine how poorly Britain can be administered. 1,000 years after the Norman invasion, and they still administer their state in much worse manner than many continental countries. They manage their business very well, or used to. The democratic life of the Union, therefore, has institutional backup. From policy, however, today we can talk about a European polity. Indeed, there is European polity. It's Trans-Europa Express polity, it's scientific polity, it's student polity, but it's not the people. Maybe we don't have to care that much about the people, because the people, after all, is the sovereign that cannot decide anything. Have you noticed how people and populists in this country, who always speak in the name and on behalf of the people, are very much anti-direct democracy? Yes, indeed, because democracy means conflict and confrontation. And I would like to conclude my talk by saying, let's not shy away from conflict, let's not shy away from confrontation, because we already, the question is always, should we have more mobilization or should we have more instrumentalization of European project? Today, we know that these two are two independent variables. They are not dependent of each other. During the Iraq War, some of the finest minds of Europe came up with the manifesto against and calling for the mobilization of the European public. You may recall Jürgen Habermas, Jacques Derrida, already very ill, and Gianni Mattimo, and Richard Rorty from across the Atlantic, calling for that now is the time for creating the European public, because we Europeans are different from Americans and American. The problem is that, yes, you could get millions of people on streets and squares of Europe, but these millions, they then go home and they don't mobilize anymore. The problem is with the party politics. This country is experiencing probably the worst crisis of democracy since 1989 because of the crisis of political parties. We don't have European political parties, but even national political parties don't behave like European political parties. In Britain it's excessive, but even elsewhere. You cannot combat the rise of populism by simply saying, you're bad, you're not good Europeans, you bad behaved, you are anti-immigration, you don't belong, you're enemies. No, you have to confront them on political ground. So you are our enemies because your project is not viable. Because if you call for the national currency, budget for it. If you want immigrants out, budget for your health care, and budget, if you simply shout immigrants out in British hospitals, there would be nobody left but patients on intensive care. If you immigrants out, who would be making those finest German cars in German plants? If Turkish workers would be sent home, would it be Vorsprung durch Technik? No. We live in global world, and this is one problem, and there are other problems. So politicize, but you have to politicize through making the political project and the European project much more the question of democratic politics at national level and European level. exactly like the Lisbon Treaty assumes, that there will be much more communication between European Parliament and national parliaments. You can't have the people, you have to have representative bodies. And this is where I probably should stop, because civil society can do a lot. But civil society is not... we have either Scottish Enlightenment project, that civil society is this nicely organized, spontaneously society out of which the state grows and manages. This is Ferguson. Or you have the Hegelian concept that civil society is fine but deficient and therefore has to be topped up by the universal state and its morality which supersedes civil society and compensates for its deficiencies. No, we have to admit that civil society is not an ethical fabric, because if we say that it's spontaneously evolving politics, it can be even radical and dangerous for democracy. Yes, democracy is not just peace. Democracy is also war. And here I would like to quote two French philosophers who are very radical. Nevertheless, as Michel Foucault says, politics is the continuation of war by other means. Turning the Clausewitz formula upside down. And I have to say, if somebody speaks, if it's a diplomat or a bureaucrat, about peace in Europe as a great achievement that we mustn't drop, that we mustn't rock the boat, what kind of peace is it if you have 50% unemployment in several states of the Eurozone? It's the war by other means. If you call for austerity, for putting you back on track, at what cost? At the cost, this is a war. Euro has brought us war. War on generations, war on different populations, and war between those who have and those who have not. Second, I'm wrapping up here. So civil society should bring us conflict into Europe, and we have to fight for Europe. Political parties have to institutionalize and use what has been institutionalized by the Lisbon Treaty and push it further by simply creating representations of European issues. Otherwise, more representation, maybe less democracy, but more representation at European level. Because more representation means more legitimacy. More political mobilization through civil society may create more conflict, but more representation brings more stability. And I shall stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jiří, for that complex approach to a more conflict-driven polity. And now it's Martin, your turn.
Thanks. It's really not so easy to continue after listening to so many layers and frameworks and platforms of one of the top brains, as you said, a global professor, Jiří Přibáň. But because originally I was expected to be on the place of the moderator, I prepared my contribution as I would say, couple of remarks and comments to what we have discussed yesterday, and perhaps a couple of question marks which will indirectly follow Jiří's talk in that sense, that what are the capacities of civil society actors to enter this way of decision making in the European Union and shaping the Union. It will be an unsystematic talk, so I hope you will understand it. First, I would like to return for a moment to narratives. At the end of his presentation, Jiří was talking that EU, Europe has brought also wars, not only peace, obviously in the new class. But, well, what I appreciated on yesterday's debate was this call for some external motivation, for some external mirror, which would help us Europeans, the members of the Union, to reinvigorate the European dream and the idea which is behind the Union. I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to visit the exhibition in this house, which is the exhibition of posters called Clash of Ideologies during the last century, from 1914 to 2014. And what is especially impressive there is the posters from two wars, from the First World War, then the posters from interwar period with the rise of Bolshevism and the rise of Nazism, then the Second World War and the Stalinist period. And I was thinking that if this exhibition would become an offer for all high school students in European countries, they would probably slightly better understand what is peace about, how today's European Union was constructed and is developing. And if Jiří mentioned the contrast between two types of music, Ode to Joy and this technocratic, I think there is just one sort of music which would accompany those exhibition of posters. It's just military marches. So this is the first. And I think this is also something what could help probably the young generation to understand this European narrative. The second remark or comment is in September last year there was Forum 2000 and there was a panel on civil society. Under the title is Civil Society Still a Positive Force? And it was a fascinating composition of the panel because Martin Palos was there and Danuta Glondis on the Central European side, and then there were two non-Europeans. It was Michael Anti, a famous blogger and commentator, a Chinese commentator, and then Leopold Lopez. And it was really a difference in everything. The Central Europeans were able to reflect and to somehow comment from the distance what's is the civil society about, and those two young, dynamic persons were absolutely dedicated and devoted to this concept of liberal democracy. Mark said there are now 500 million of internet users in China, and the democracy is going on, and one cannot resist to it. Leopold Lopez, who by the way yesterday was just arrested by Venezuelan authorities, young leader of the opposition there, was convincing the audience how important it is to believe in this liberal democratic dream. And so these are just two recollections, and the last one is which was with us from the very beginning. It is for the first time, and I think it's not banal, that people in Kiev have been dying under the European flag. So these are three external mirrors which somehow came into my mind when we were talking about narratives. Secondly, I will just comment what Jiří suggested. One of those instruments of direct democracy or of increasing of citizens' participation is this citizens' initiative project incorporated in the Lisbon Treaty. If I can quote from one of the comments of the first initiative, which was not successful to gather 1 million of signatories. It was about Erasmus and about mobility in the European space, and they said, well, e-democracy is a wonderful tool to close the gap between EU citizens and institutions. Technical barriers and a lack of trust have hindered its use. Until now there were 3 initiatives, and I think there were more of them, but 3 were successful. Right for water, stop vivisection, it was about prohibiting the experiments on animals, and One of Us, it was the initiative which proposed to forbid the investment in Planned Parenthood in stem cell research in non-European countries by European money. So what we see is that at least in this first phase, in this first period of using this citizens' initiative project, there are international networks which are able to mobilize the support and gather enough signatories, environmentalists, human rights organization, or in the last case, the conservative networks. We will see how it will develop, but there are obviously some limits to use this newly introduced and newly incorporated vehicle. Third, I'd like to reflect briefly on what I call the capacities of civil society actors to enter this opportunities, this possibility to shape the image and the work of the Union. Our Institute of Public Affairs, during the last 20 years, we have been following and monitoring and analyzing the civil society in the Central European countries, doing also some conferences. So what we can see is, first, I think if we take NGOs as one of the actors of civil society, it's not the whole civil society, but anyway, I think where they are quite good and efficient and visible and influential is if they are doing civic control, if they are providing critical feedback to state power, if they are somehow implementing this watchdog dimension of civil society roles. There are organizations like Transparency International branches in different countries. Petr Pithard yesterday mentioned this Czech initiative, Reconstruction of the State. And they were quite successful in imposing pressure on politicians to adopt anti-corruption legislation, to work against what used to be called state capture. It might not be state capture in the Czech Republic, but we know what we are talking about. In fact, here is the, I would say, the space for some possible positive influences, also on the European level. If I just very briefly recollect some examples of massive public mobilization in 1998 in Slovakia, it was really the massive input of civil society actors which led to the removal of the semi-authoritarian government of Vladimir Mečiar. We had 84% of turnout and young people voted. Then with the new reform government there was another clash, another struggle, and it was about the passing of the good Freedom of Information or Freedom of Information Act, because it was a reform government, but they were not very happy to pass a really substantial and strong legislation. Finally, there were 120 organizations which gathered 100,000 of the members, and the law was passed. And here the activist role and the expert role was involved. And last was 2 years ago by Greenpeace, by the way, which started a petition demanding the greatest saying of local self-governments about issues of mining and uranium mining and so on. Finally, they got enough signatories, Parliament voted in it, and now it's also up to local governments to influence any decision about mining, including uranium mining. I think the civil society actors are also quite good and quite developed in Visegrad countries and in other countries as for the advocacy. I'm not going to elaborate in detail, but this is their typical role and they are quite good. In some countries, third, they were also efficient as a resource of alternative policies. Some reforms were actually originally designed, prepared, discussed in this independent civic sector before they were overtaken and implemented by politicians. They are also good force as a laboratory of innovations, different innovations. Literally hundreds of innovations were firstly implemented on the NGO level and then overtaken by state. And finally, they are also quite visible especially on local and regional level. This is on the level of the possibilities of civil society actors. However, if we look at states, and not only in those new democracies, but it's also a certain tendency also in all democracies. But if we limit only on those new democracies, so I think there is certain tendency to reduce the non-profit only as a provider of services. It means somehow to remove this Tocquevillian vision of an active civil society rather to those who are providers of services and usually are dependent on funding by governments and by state. Then there are tendencies in states to behave in a formal way. It means, yes, NGOs are invited, they are discussed, a sort of participatory procedure, but at the end of the day, their proposals are practically ignored. Then we have political parties who are quite frequently creating the close circles of that political class, and they are not very eager to listen to independent voices and independent civil society ideas. And finally, there are still some situations when we have states, now even in the European Union, when if the state is governed by a very strong party which has a constitutional majority, so we saw it under Mečiar, now we saw something like that in Hungary, that there was a tendency to create the state civil society organization, which was undermining these checks and balances and which limited the space for civil society actors. If we look, so this was civil society actors, this was the state, and now on the level of society, there are some new challenges and there are some still existing problems. And I would say, it's an area of contradiction. First of all, the question of participation. What we saw, especially during the crisis, but during the last decade, the participation in new member states especially is limited because of this increase of individualism, increase of simply taking care about families and about the careers and so on. So people have to focus on their careers, do not have that much time to be involved in something what is overreaching them. Then there is a deep institutional distrust. I think this is also the case in the old democracies, but in these new it's quite difficult. What we also see that the participation is limited by the fact that after 25 years after the change, many people see that in comparison with the previous regime, there are at least some areas where the situation is unchanged or even worse. So if we ask them in repeated surveys and research that what are the chances to influence the political decisions, what are the chances to be successful by honest work, and what are the chances for equality before the law, in all of those three cases the answer was negative. No, it's not better under this regime. And finally, we see some, besides the old and known populists of all sorts, besides the far-right mobilization, we also see a new element which is becoming and more widespread, and which was reflected also in the voting for the new or so-called new alternative political actors on the political scene. It was not only Beppe Grillo, and it was not only extreme right and radical left in Greece, it was also in Slovenia. In Slovenia in 2011, the election won a party which was established 3 weeks ago, before the elections. It didn't create coalition, but then later, after the crisis, they created the government. And it is I would say, the dissemination of anti-systemic approaches, of anti-systemic moods, sometimes combined with conspirational mindset. Finally, there are also some positive tendencies which I would summarize like the increase of usually unregistered initiative, new leaders, new projects, new initiatives in a small scope, improving and increasing the quality of life in communities. They have emerged. There are a lot of them they haven't been politicized enough in order to simply focus on politics, because they are slightly distrustful to politics as such. But if they will get a positive vision, they might even improve the situation in this field. And finally, returning to narratives, if I just, in 1 minute, if you allow me to mention what was the development of the narratives in the last 25 years in Slovakia, one of the typical narratives is the narratives of a victim, yes? So it was present not only in Slovakia, but in many other countries, yes, small nation which is a victim of the stronger neighbors, and simply it's not so easy to cope, to handle this situation. Then, when the Slovakia succeeded in economic reforms, there was completely opposite narrative, and it was a narrative of so-called Tatra Tiger. Yes, we are the most successful country with its reforms, 10% of growth, 10% of unemployment. This is the new vision of Slovakia. Well, it has appeared that it's more problematic and it's no more valid. The most attractive vision was that of a variation of constitutional patriotism, which was practically oriented against a nationalistic understanding of nationalistic projects, and which I think is still there, is still attractive, even if not fulfilled. And if we as Europeans should return to something what would encourage us, I will never forget the Pope's visit, John Paul II in Slovakia in 1995. It was in mature times, a lot of tensions, kidnapping of presidential son, and really the very, very bad political atmosphere. Millions of people gathered in his mass, and he just said one sentence, actually 2 words, which are the same in Slovak and in Polish. And he addressed the gathering and he said, "Nie bójcie się, don't be afraid." And I think we need also here in Europe what Michal Šantovský was quoting Václav Havel, spiritual, emotional and other dimensions. Just don't be afraid to think out of the box, to think in an imaginative way. And after visiting that exhibition of military ideologies, to believe that European dream is still valid and still has to say a lot for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much. As we are well advanced in time, I'm going immediately to the audience. So please raise your hands if you have any commentary. Or the first one is here. Here there are 2. Please bring them in. No, you need the microphone, because otherwise it cannot be translated.
Jiří Přibáň, in the end of his speech, he tried to put together war and politics and play with Clausewitz and maybe what was the contemporary philosopher. I think it's somewhat dangerous. I'm coming from the UN environment, and I think that politics rather should result in peaceful solution of conflicts, and just to say that whatever unemployment exists in that country, that it is a war, I think puts us in a very slippery slope and could just open a Pandora box of wars, box of violence. But more serious question concerns the relationship between politics of interests and politics of values. I think that this, I would say, sharp opposition. You either support or go after your selfish interest, or you are humanist and support values. That is somewhat confusing and dangerous. I think that we, and actually Europe, might be a very great opportunity to show that interests and values are related in much more complicated, I would say, deeper way. Than you can have interest in values, and you can respect as your first value the protection of interests of those who are within society. Yesterday, when I was seeing the Václav Havel statement of Ukraine, in one point I was not certain that I could agree with him. when he mentioned that Ukraine should be given a chance to make their own decision. Zones of influence is something what we should simply avoid. I think that it's exactly what Europe should do, to be influential there, and that's what Ukrainians are asking for, basically, if they are just left in their choices and with this somewhat abstract language of values, without interest and zones of influence, the result will be much worse. Your comment?
If you would get the microphone exactly right before you, and then you will.
Good morning. My name is Milan Rokitka, Econ Czech, and I have a question. Do we not close ourselves into the European civil society? Econ works in the US. Brother Obama was there as a social worker. He helped the discriminated black brothers, and then there were the problem with the Republicans. We saw that, unfortunately, politics intervened in the civic sector negatively. They accused them of trading in humans, but Econ was not lazy. The civic sector is very active, and they started founding Econs everywhere in Africa, in South America, even here. They came here, they gave us the flag and the brochures and so on, but of course we are in close contact. And I think that if we talk about civil society, we must not limit ourselves to the European Union, because in the EU there doesn't need to be a war. We will still say that, yes, that is good that we do not have the war, but it is because of the Cold War. And there could be a war between the US, let's say, and Russia, or between the US and China. So let us build civil society in a more global way. And I would like to hear from you, the personalities present here. I'm very glad to be here. I would like to hear from you an opinion. Don't you think that we are limited too much to the European Union, and Europe is not that popular in the world because of the colonialism and the heritage we have? So let us try to build the civil society globally. We can also work in Slovakia. We do not have our branch in Slovakia, but it's rather a joke. Thank you.
I wanted to congratulate Martin on his quite brilliant overview of the various forms and modes of civil society. And I wanted to ask him about some of the stranger animals that one sometimes encounters in this area. In Britain I learned a new English word for me. It's quango, that's the quasi-NGOs, which fulfill some of the functions that could be fulfilled by civil society, but they are not independent of the government, and in fact they seem to be part of the government. And then there are, you know, all kinds of think tanks and civil society groups that you encounter, and many of them are very pro-European and very helpful in disseminating information about the EU, etc. The problem is that they are often funded by EU money. And so I'd like to hear your view whether this is supplementing the civil society, or is it a way of co-opting the civil society, which are two different things, right?
Okay, I don't know whether there are any other.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I propose to take you, and then we will have the last round.
Pleskot is my name. I have a question. I wonder whether when we interpret the Ukrainian crisis, especially when it is interpreted by the media and when we interpret the European policy, whether there is no conflict between the interests and values, or in other words, the implementation capacities to impose it. I believe that in this country, the media do not provide us with an appropriate image of the ethnical, political, and other structures of Ukraine. So this is my first question. And then one more question. Even yesterday, in some of the presentations on civil society, I heard an undertone that had been always criticized by the dissidents. We should probably change the people, because the people does not understand us. I especially felt that when we were talking about the youth, because I have the feeling that there is a communication problem. Many of the presenters know the young only as university students, young students and intellectuals, especially those who study the human studies. I think that Petr Pithal was the closest to the solution when he tried to explain how he explains the basic questions.
Thank you very much. I will now give Jiří and Martin the chance to respond to those commentaries and ask the organizers whether normally we should close this exactly at this time, whether there is a time for a second round, or should we? Yes? Okay.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, so very briefly, thank you very much for the most interesting and difficult questions. Of course, I use the metaphor or the language of war and peace as a response to that argument that if we don't have common currency, there will be war in Europe. You know, this was a common argument that Euro will save us from next war. And clearly we have such frictions and divisions created by the currency that I think it's not a huge exaggeration to use this comparison, because it is a complete social collapse which the euro is causing. And unlike I mentioned Foucault, I don't believe with Foucault that power is everywhere and there is no outside to power. But politics is about power. What is politics? It's the power to enforce collectively binding decisions. This is the easiest definition of politics, which is democratic, authoritarian, totalitarian, whatever you wish. This power to enforce collectively binding decisions then looks for its legitimation, and that's why I think still it could be a legitimation by both, by interests and values. It's a classic distinction, and I think we don't have to worry about it too much. But by using this metaphor of war, I wanted to show what level, what scale of crisis we are actually facing. And I'm not talking just about Spain, Ireland, or Greece. I'm talking about the future crisis. I completely agree that legitimation by the past, and let's bury the bad things in the past, is not enough. We have to look into the future. And the future doesn't look bright. It looks very, very bleak. The next generation is going to start its life, if not in unemployment and without education, it will still start it with debt. What about this greed of current people who are currently retiring and expecting to live for 20 to 25 years on the pensions supported by the young generation? I find it repulsive. Young generation is asked to contribute to its education, to everything. The expectation of the young generation to fund its life is enormous, and in return you will fund our life. The collapse of social solidarity pact is complete in Europe. So civil society is global, I completely agree. One thing I didn't mention, because I thought it would be too speculative, too theoretical, is actually European integration is far too short for a global problem. It's just the regional segmentation of, yes, we integrate, but it's just one territorial segment of global society. And global civil society, of course, is emerging without and beyond Europe. And you have global power play, but civil society, and especially NGOs, are very important and very influential power players. It's not just those nice guys. What has happened to the Amnesty International is one of the most fascinating transformations of the originally Quaker ethics-driven ethical institution. Simply write in your name on behalf of another person to the head of state or the Ministry of Interior in an authoritarian regime and say, I, John Smith, want to kindly ask you, sir, to consider the political prisoner in your country. Today, it's a policy-making machine, so let's not be too... Let's not think that it's a nice, cozy world of global NGOs. They are power players. But I completely agree, there is global civil society emerging beyond and independently of Europe. Different layer of civil society. Yes, you could tell that we divided the labor here. That I didn't mention the civic initiative, Article 12 of the Lisbon Treaty, because I knew who is a better expert, but Martin delivered it beautifully, like nobody else could do this. So he will say much more about it.
Yes, I think Michael, you touched an important and delicate aspect of the civil society actors' activities. And you are right, there are different names and acronyms for organizations which are either not only financed but de facto controlled by state. There are different gongos and there are a lot of acronyms which are reflecting it. I think the way how to cope with it is simply to be as transparent as possible and to have as much diverse portfolio of resources as possible. So it means not just EU money, not just the domestic money, but also, as far as it is possible, more colorful portfolio of donors and sponsors. And what's interesting, I didn't mention it, but here I see also a certain chance which is resulting from relatively, I'm not saying pessimistic, but not very optimistic conclusion. What we see now in these countries is that after 25 years, there are people who want to remain, who want to live here in their homelands, and who somehow understand that we are to a certain extent back to the days of all those velvet revolutions. It means that it's again a challenge for citizens to take their own issues into their hands, because it's not the state which will solve it, it's not the government, it's not the market, it's not the political parties. It's really depends on the involvement and on the energy, on the will, on the potential to participate and somehow to look around and to think what I could do in order to change it. And for those actors it is important also to show in how far the European institutions can be helpful in, I would say, this new awareness rising and this understanding and accepting the fact that it simply won't improve, it won't change without the civic initiatives. And if the young people are asking, and it's quite legitimate, the people who were active in the changes 25 years ago, my God, that you made so many mistakes, you somehow didn't prove to be efficient, and the regime which we have here is unjust, and I could go on and on and on. The fact is that the same questions, they will be asked in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And the possibilities for being involved, the possibilities for having an opportunity to participate and influence are definitely much higher than it was 25 years ago under communism. And I think this is also the message which is important, how to inspire and mobilize civic activities.
Thank you. Are there any? No. Oh no. Yeah.
Jaroslav Anděl. I have a question for Mr. Přibáň. He was talking about the need for politicization. But I think we see that happening in our country, for example, this pogrom-like demonstration against Roma, and there are many other examples. So I understand that what he means is positive politicization, and I would like to press him to be a little bit more specific.
I don't see any more. Did I? No, here it is.
My name is Michal Pečina, I'm a student here, and I have a question about issues and about this conflict. Why don't we see legitimate political conflict on European level? You know, things like immigration. Why doesn't anybody argue the positive side? Because you always hear people like Herterich and Le Pen and what have you. They are dismissed as extremists, you know, as in saying, well, we all know that immigration is bad, but you are just going too far. Why isn't anybody saying that immigration is awesome? You know, it makes us richer. This is the right thing to do in the name of freedom and tolerance and everything. Why doesn't anybody say so? Or, you know, things like agricultural subsidies. You know, why doesn't anybody say on the European level, city dwellers of the world unite and stop subsidizing those locals in France and so on? Why aren't these issues discussed? Why the positive side is silent? And then all these extremists are presenting themselves as, you know, the ones who are speaking truth to power. Thank you.
Okay, I think that was the last one. And Jiří and Martin, if you want to respond.
Okay, first about politicization. Yes, isn't it interesting that, for instance, and you started from this country, so I will use the example in this country. I think we are in a situation of that many people don't believe politicians, but they believe in some Bob the Builder who can fix it. Yeah, that I think in Czech it's that fairy tale for little kids called Bořek Stavitel, I think. Yeah, Bob the Builder character. And now we have Bob the Builder who is going to fix it because he has a magic formula. He knows that the state is just another corporation, and he's going to fix it. So we don't need politicians, we need business people. Okay? If only we knew what business people are able to do and capable to do, we would probably appreciate politicians a bit more. If our politicians didn't behave like servants of business people. This is the biggest problem in Czech, but not only in Czech Republic. It's a European problem that European politicians behave like servants of the globalization is economic globalization without taking into account political costs. So for me, politicization means, and this is already responding to your question, it's like you have to tackle negative politicization or mobilization, because skinheads mobilize, of course, radicals mobilize. If you want to tackle it, you can't just say you're bad and we will have the law against you, after you. No, you have to politically tackle it, you have to mobilize it. And it's interesting that in Britain, when really with Bulgarian and Romanian migrants, the discussion started to be nasty, but, and this is amazing about Britain, the moment it really goes over the top, some people started budgeting and actually calculating the benefit of immigration. These people who come are not here simply to give me. They simply, I want to improve my life. It's an individual choice. I want to improve my life, and obviously I'm going to pay my taxes. I want facilities which are available to all European citizens, but I'm not here just to beg. Yeah? And this narrative has become very stronger and stronger. I don't want to very strong, I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's a counter-narrative to anti-immigration. I think for this you need exactly civil society, the media, who would immediately criticize what becomes a major or dominating narrative. Yeah? So that's quite important, and some people might know my work, so they know that I am not a Euro-optimist, or as in this country that absolutely dreadful called Euro-wear. I'm not a Euro-wear, but I don't believe in the European state, because we cannot reconstruct the European state. But what we need a lot more together with this is the European rule of law and the European rights and freedoms guaranteed for all Europeans, whether they are Romanians, Bulgarians, or Belgians and Spaniards. And this applies even to this country, whether they are ethnic Czech or Roma or Vietnamese. I don't care whether Vietnamese, the contribution of the Vietnamese community to this country is just enormous. Let's appreciate it.
Martin?
No, I think Jiří concluded it.
I'm thankful for your comment and question, because this gives me the chance to give you an example. On the there was just a few days ago in Germany there was published a survey on attitudes toward migration, and migration normally is a topic. Immigration in Germany mostly is a topic which is very hot politically, and the established political parties normally try to avoid it or say, well, we are protecting you against too much immigration, and so on and so on. Now the interesting thing is that the fact is that in Germany immigration has considerably risen during the last 3 to 4 years. And 1 year ago, people, when asked about immigration, 67% rejected more immigration. The majority, almost 2/3. Then happened on January 1st, the free movement and immigration of citizens from Romania and Bulgaria was the new fact in the picture, and second, the Swiss vote on immigration. In this case, of course, it was less directed against Bulgarians and Romanians, and more against Germans and Italians, as we know. But nevertheless, both of these things have led to an extensive debate on immigration, and the government and the political parties were forced to defend the free movement within the EU, and of course they pointed to the benefits of it all, and the result was that in the last survey after these debates, there was rising awareness of the fact that there has been more and is more immigration, but at the same time dropping fear. It were only 49% against before 67% who rejected more immigration, which still is a relative majority.
Yes, but the public debate has
helped, the public debate has very much helped against the politics of fear. So with this note on hope, I will close the session, and thank you for following and your engagement in the debate, and thank you, Martin, and you, Jiří, for your wonderful contributions. Thank you.